Some people are calling it their secret weapon, cycling's next game changer, super sauce. Alright, I made that last one up, but I'm referring to ketones. Cycling has been at the forefront of sports science for probably the last 15 years, and the next thing on its extensive list is ketones. But have you heard of ketones? What are ketones? How do I use them? Do they improve performance? And do they really taste that bad? Well, luckily I have been in contact with Delta G, who make, supply and advise on ketones. And they've also sent me some to test so I can share my personal experiences with you. Right, let's dive into some questions. I'm also going to be using these for IM Alcudia on the 11th of May this year, so subscribe if you want to see how that goes using these ketones. Okay, first question, what are ketones? If you already know what they are, you can skip through the chapters, but for those of you who don't, here is a brief explanation. Right, so your brain runs primarily on carbohydrates, but when we start to go into a diet that doesn't have carbohydrates in it, the brain has to run on something and it can't be fats. So what the body does is the liver, it starts to break down fats and it produces ketones, and the brain itself can use ketones as a fuel source so it can keep working. Hence why it's called the keto diet, because it makes your body produce ketones. So in short, that is what it is. It is a fourth fuel source that the body can use for energy. And it's not just the brain, but your muscles can also use it as well. Well, with that, how do you use ketones? Basically, they come in a small bottle that you take a shot of, and it's just a very simple drink. Here's the protocol on how to use them. You can use them 30 minutes before exercise, every 2 hours during exercise, if it's a prolonged hard event, or you can also take it straight after exercise if you want to use them for recovery as well. It's up to you. Personally, for me, I found taking them before and during an event gave me the best performance and recovery, but more about my personal experiences later. You can't just have a shot and expect it to work. You need to have the ideal blood levels or the right range to be working in. So between 1 to 2 millimoles per litre is where you want to be for cognitive function or cognitive improvements. Then from 2 to 3.5 millimoles per litre is where we start to see the performance increases when using ketones. This can be tested using a simple blood testing kit, and once you know what levels a shot of ketones gets you to, you don't really need to keep on testing from there. That's all you really need to know. It's as simple as timing and volume, how much you take and when you take it. I will get onto how much I needed to take and those levels I got to later as well. Let's get on to probably the bit you came here for. How do they improve performance? First of all, before I go into any more details, there is limited research on ketones so far, but here is what we are starting to see in the research. Bearing in mind, this could all change 5 years from now as more research starts to show itself. The current working theory of how it all works is that at sub-maximal efforts, i.e. endurance sports, the body can use ketones alongside fats and carbohydrates as a fuel source. Think of it as just stuffing more fuel into the body before an event. But because the ketones can be used at a wide range of aerobic intensities, it essentially allows you to save carbohydrates for later during an endurance event. In turn, meaning you can go harder for longer. Which leads me on to recovery, where we are seeing the most benefits from ketones. The reduced lactate buildup could be a part of the reason people are recovering faster, but the causation hasn't been established yet. We are once again seeing a dampening in the effects of overtraining, which once again could be due to the reduced lactate accumulation, but this is just speculation here on my side. Finally, when using ketones for those harder sessions, they are seeing a small increase in red blood cell count. Nothing along the lines of altitude training, and definitely nothing close to what we see with EPO doping, but we are seeing an increase in endogenous EPO, so your own body's response to training. And apparently this effect is better when combined ketones with altitude training as well, as you would expect. On a slightly side note, but one of the best times to use ketones is straight after a concussion. Glucose use of the brain cells decrease after concussion, but it seems that they'll continue to use ketones, increasing the recovery speed from a TBI, a traumatic brain injury. When it comes to actual endurance performance, the efficacy of the research is more limited here, as for me, I believe the research they've done on it so far isn't really the use case for ketones. When looking at the research, generally they do like an hour to an hour and a half of steady state training and do like a 30-minute time trial after that. For me, these studies are just not long enough to see ketones thrive in their endurance environment. So we need to do some longer tests, but they're not long for ketones. Especially if you're a middle or full distance triathlete, these tests just don't get anywhere near those kind of timescales. There's also no research yet on back-to-back days of training where ketones seem to be showing most of their benefits, and this is why a lot of Tour de France riders are using them, because we seem to be seeing a faster recovery rate in people that do use ketones. Lactate levels from some of these studies show a lower level of lactate compared to the non-ketone runs after extensive endurance work. Let's get on to my experiences. Here's what I found when I was using Delta G ketones. At 85 kilos, I was taking one bottle before training or a race, and a bottle of tactical or performance got me to around 3.3 millimoles, right at the top of that performance zone. If you're smaller than I, you may only need to take half a bottle at a time, and this will pull you into that performance zone. Final thing before about talking about my performance, when I tested a different brand, the HVMN, the IQ ketones, one shot only got me up to 0.8, so it didn't even get me into the cognitive zone. So I took 3 shots to try and pull it a bit higher, and I got 0.8 again. So I don't know what happened there. Just, I guess it's not a good of a product for me. What about the cognitive benefits that I found? When taking them, I couldn't tell any difference. I don't really have a need for coffee or caffeine outside of racing, so I'm a bit of an outlier in this sense. And maybe if you do rely on caffeine a bit more, you might see more of an effect. Once again, just speculating here. When it comes to performance and recovery, however, here I genuinely believe it was more than a placebo effect. Here are my reasons. For me, I only actually used it when I was doing my longer tempo or threshold sessions. I found I was personally able to spend more time at threshold. When I was at threshold efforts, I actually found the efforts easier to do. And if you need a bit of data, I was generally sitting between 2 to 5 beats a minute lower on those threshold efforts. I also found I actually hit a half marathon PB whilst taking these as well. And whether that was down to a case of training or the ketones themselves, probably a little bit of both. I also believe it felt like to me, I mean, I've done enough training over my life to kind of feel where your lactate levels are. It felt like I was producing less lactate at these tempo or threshold efforts. I don't have a lactate meter to back this up, but it's what it felt like to me. It wasn't like it magically added 10 watts to my FTP in cycling, like it's not that big of a gain, but like I said, it felt like I could spend more time there at those higher efforts. When it came to recovery, I found that my resting heart rate was recovering faster after these sessions. I also found after these harder sessions that my heart rate variability dropped less. So 2 pretty good markers of how well you've recovered from that night's sleep. I'm just going to run over my hypothesis here. And for me, as I'm very carbohydrate dominant, using another fuel source that didn't build lactate really benefited me. If you are more like a slow oxidative or a slow twitch fiber and you utilize fats much better than I, maybe your results might be different. But the way that I see it is you wouldn't see these guys in the Tour de France and the Ironmans using this for no reason. On another interesting note, my brother's also doing some Ironmans with me this year, and he didn't really notice the performance gains himself. To him, he actually felt the same when he was taking them. But once again, when we looked at his heart rate recovery and heart rate variability, that was actually better overnight and was recovering faster after his bigger training sessions. So it seemed like for him, it was his recovery where he noticed the benefits the most. There is one more important thing I do need to talk about, and that is the taste. I've heard some people say you get used to it, or it's not too bad. No. How? The only thing I can relate it to is if I was to imagine what paint stripper actually tasted like, this is what it tastes like. Thankfully, it's just a small shot so you can get it down, but man, I need like a chaser afterwards to get the taste out of my mouth. It is bad. Unfortunately, one rather pricey barrier they have is the cost. So I think 95% of people, this is out of reach at the moment. But I believe if you are building up to your biggest race of the year, say a full or a half Ironman, most people pay a lot more for just a 1 to 2 watt gain on their oversized pulley wheel. If you're using this for like 1 to 3 races a year, it's a lot cheaper for more gains, I would argue. But let's talk about the prices. So in the UK, it is £25 or $31 per bottle. It goes down a little bit if you buy it in bulk, but I think this shows how hard these are to manufacture at the moment. But I do believe it will get better and it will get cheaper over time, making it more accessible. For my conclusion, here we have something that is for pushing the final limit of your natural performance, just by adding a different fuel source into the body. It can be used to your advantage just to edge ahead on recovery, or when it comes to performance. There is still a lot of testing to do, and I believe that they need to start testing the right kinds of events that ketones are actually going to be used for before we start to see some real data come through. On the other hand, I would love to know what you guys think of this. Is this the next revolution in performance, or is it just another fad? I believe if one day they can bring the price down and make it more accessible to most athletes, then this could be something to shout home about. But until then, it's going to be saved for those big races of the year, 1 or 2 races, and that's where most people are going to use them. Well guys, I've been Jason, this has been Cycling Unboxed, pretty fun one to make. I'll see you for IM Alcudia. Ciao!